Today on Blue Values TV, we're going to talk about transportation issues in Placer County. Stay tuned. Welcome to Blue Values TV. Blue Values TV is a production of the Blue Values Coalition. The Blue Values Coalition is dedicated to educating, informing, and engaging our neighbors in the governance of our communities. Look for us online at bluevaluescoalition.org. Our guest today is Ms. Celia McAdam, the Executive Director of the Placer County Transportation Planning Commission. Do I have that right? Agency. I was so close.
Close enough.
I was so close. Welcome to the show, Celia. It's a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you, Jack. Glad to be here.
And we've got a lot to talk about because, as you can imagine, transportation is something that affects everyone in the county. Most people are affected by not only roads, which affects almost everyone, but then they're affected by public transportation and the plans for the future. As we build up more of our county, what's going to happen to our transportation infrastructure. So we're going to talk about all of that today. And you are an amazingly knowledgeable and informed person about what's going on here. So let's get right down to it.
Okay.
What is the status of transportation in Placer County? What are the bright spots and what are some of the areas that we still need to work on?
Well, I will say that there are many things we need to work on all different modes of transportation. But let me start with the bright spot and in terms of what my agency has been involved with and leading the way on. And I would go with the I-80 bottleneck, which opened up back in 2011.
I remember that one well.
It took a long time, but added carpool lanes and what are known as auxiliary lanes, which are those lanes in between the interchanges. And that's a bright spot. Of course, that's created challenges as we fix that. Then you have the I-80-65 interchange that has now become the hot spot of our challenge. I would also say, in terms of bright spots, the Lincoln bypass. I've spent a lot of my career working on that project. It is the longest segment of new freeway in California in the last 10 years.
That's incredible.
And here in Placer County, which is not by any means the largest county in California, it's made a huge difference, not only in terms of people driving around through Northern California, but also to downtown Lincoln, because instead of having all those trucks and people who weren't stopping there and plugging things up, now they're able to have a downtown that people want to come to, that's walkable, that is attracting the local community. So it's been a win-win. That's a big bright spot.
And that's definitely what we've been hearing even from the city officials in Lincoln. So that absolutely, that's been incredible.
I understand their sales tax revenue has gone up as well. So that's another illustration. On the other hand, that was a very expensive project, about $324 million. And that leads us to some of the challenges for Placer County, which is I have got plans for all of these challenges that we've got. I don't have the money.
I understand. Now, let's back up a little bit. We talked about the Lincoln bypass, and you said that you spent much of your career working on that. Tell us, how long did that take, and why did it take so long?
Well, depending on who you ask, it took about 35 years from the time it was first proposed to the time it was actually built. Now, of course, the rules for transportation changed a lot in that time. And there were issues such as there was money programmed to do the initial work on the project, but then there were earthquakes that happened in LA and the Bay Area that took all the transportation money in the state, went to seismic retrofit, and things like the Lincoln bypass were left on the sidelines. But in transportation in major highway projects, there's essentially 4 stages. The first is what's known as the environmental stage, and that takes a long time to go through and analyze what the impacts of this proposal is and look at alternatives and all of the public outreach on that, and you have regulatory agencies. It's a very specific process that you have to go through certain steps, and it is very vulnerable to legal challenges.
Yep.
So you have to dot your I's and cross your T's, and it takes a very long time. The Lincoln Bypass environmental document took 10 years.
10 years.
10 years. And that doesn't include some stops and starts because of that funding with the seismic retrofit. And then you have the design process, so that, you know, the engineers are out there figuring out where the roads go and making sure that everything aligns properly, and bridges and structures and such. And then you have the right-of-way process, which was complicated with the Lincoln Bypass. It about a quarter of the money for the project was in right-of-way.
So this is acquiring the land that's
Right.
going to be used.
Right, because people own the land and they want to be compensated fairly for it. And of course, we were at a time when land values were going up, at one time, 3% a month. It was very challenging. And then you go into construction. Lincoln Bypass was actually a fairly short construction schedule, considering it's 10 miles, actually it's almost 12 miles of brand new road. It only took 4 years. And it took less time because you didn't have to deal with traffic, managing the traffic like you do on I-80, where you still have 150,000 cars going by and you're building things. And that makes it more difficult. The crews could work, you know, all day and not have that interference. So those are some of the things that make it a long schedule. But the biggest part of that 35 years was really trying to put together the money.
Yeah, and putting together the money is a complicated thing. For the 65 bypass, this is a mixture of different types of funds.
There are 10 different sources of funds for that. Some small, some large. You cobble together everything you can.
Right.
And what happens is when you have local money, it attracts other discretionary dollars. A good portion of the funding that ultimately paid for the Lincoln Bypass came from Proposition 1B bonds that passed back in 2006. We were far enough in the process and had a good story to tell that we were able to attract those discretionary dollars, as well as putting in $78 million of our future transportation dollars that attracted an equal amount of state discretionary dollars. And there's federal money in there. And the city of Lincoln put in money, and they did some in-kind from their wastewater treatment plant, that they used the dirt, the excavation from there, that was then placed and used as the embankment for the overcrossing over the railroad tracks.
What a neat idea.
That's the kind of creative thinking and that you need to actually get things like this built.
Yeah. So it's not a simple process, and I think most people are always confused about, gee, why do these projects take so long and stuff? But when you lay it out like that, it becomes a little bit more clear. Now, we've got 2 big bottleneck areas on our roads that I can think of. One is as you mentioned, the I-80-65 interchange, and the other is 65 itself. 65 is becoming more and more of a bottleneck every day, and it'll only get worse as we build out more of North Roseville and so on. Tell us about our plans in those 2 areas.
Well, the good news is that we are in that first phase of project development on both projects. The I-80-65 interchange, we are doing the environmental process. We're about 3 years into it. We expect to have the environmental process completed in 2016.
Okay.
So it's you know, a substantial amount of time, but actually not as slow as some others because it's fairly contained. It's not a big new road that's going 10 miles. There's a lot of constraints in there.
So right now, the higher priority would be on...
I would say I-80-65 is the top priority for my board.
Okay. So if it's another year and a half or so for the environmental impact report to, let's say, mid-2016. After that's done, the next step would be starting the design phase.
The design and the right-of-way, yes.
And timing for that?
We are trying to do that as much concurrently as we can. We are working with Caltrans on this because it's a safety issue for Caltrans, even though it's a congestion issue for a lot of Placer residents. There's a lot of fender benders because of all the traffic and all of the weaving movements in between Eureka Road and the interchange. And not everybody plays nice when they're stressed out in traffic, and not everybody pays attention. So what we're looking at is trying to do a relatively small first phase, we're calling it phase 1A, that would widen the viaduct section over the railroad tracks. Because what most people think is the problem on the 8065 interchange is the loop. And it's not. It's actually the merge.
The merge with the north and south, the east and westbound lanes of 80.
And the challenge for us is that out of the environmental document, what we found is that right now it takes a person going from the Placer-Sacramento County line, going east on I-80, through the interchange north to Blue Oaks, an average of 9 minutes. In 8 years, it's going to be 35 minutes.
Oh, wow, 35 minutes?
If we do the improvements, and not just the phase 1A, but the full improvements, that will go down to 7 minutes.
Okay, so now wait a minute. Let's understand. I hadn't heard these numbers. These are rather scary.
Yes, it is. That's why I say this is our top priority.
So 9 minutes now to go from the county line, which is roughly near Riverside Auburn exit, up to Blue Oaks. 9 minutes now, and that would more than triple.
Indeed. It's scary.
That's very scary.
And I think people are already frustrated with this situation. And the backups are also going to get worse. In the next 6 years, the backup at peak period, during rush hour, the backup is about a mile going eastbound on I-80 going
Before
up to the
interchange. Right.
That's going to be 3 miles pretty much all the way to Douglas in the next 6 years. So that becomes a top priority for us. The challenge is, of course, money.
Yeah.
We have a little bit of money cobbled together through some savings from other projects. It's a drop in the bucket. Typically, the first part of a project, the environmental and design, is usually less than 10% of the overall costs.
Okay.
In this case, it's probably along the lines of 5%. Construction is what is the most expensive. There are some substantial structures that you have to put in, these new ramps that are, high enough for large trucks to get under, and then multi-level.
Right.
It's a pretty substantial structures budget on that, and it does get expensive.
Now, can our viewers see what the different preliminary or design ideas look like?
Absolutely. We have a website. It is called 8065 or 8065 interchange.org.
Okay. And you can go to that website and get an idea of at least what the alternatives that we're looking at.
You can look at the alternatives, the designs. There's actually a conceptual drawing of what they would look like, and provide feedback as we're moving forward on the environmental, and we'll be doing public outreach later on this year.
Oh, great.
As that's ready to be brought out to the public.
Yeah, fantastic. You're saying that in the next 6 years, if we don't do anything, travel time in that stretch is going to triple. What is the earliest time when we can have enough of the project completed to not impact traffic significantly?
Well, as I mentioned, there is a first phase of the interchange that would widen that viaduct section that we're estimating will buy us about 5 years before things back up again. But we would have to be working on those next phases and double time to get them ahead of that capacity need.
Right.
As I always say, I have plans. I have all kinds of plans. I know what is needed to accommodate this growth. I just can't I don't have the money to get ahead of it.
Well, if there's anyone that's as resourceful in getting money for these projects, I don't know who it would be, because I know you've done a great job on the Lincoln Bypass, scrounging the money together for it. So I'm sure you'll be able to come up with some magic to be able to do this.
Well, and I have to say I appreciate that, but we've pulled a lot of rabbits out of hats, and I don't see any more rabbits out there. Bluntly, from the state and the feds, they just do not seem to be interested in the kinds of projects that Placer is interested in, as well as, frankly, they don't have any money. The Federal Highway Trust Fund is bankrupt, essentially. They've been transferring money from the general fund to make it solvent.
And this is where we get into the political part of the problem, and that is, what is the influence that we can have over government officials and so on to free up some of the funding for these kinds of projects as well?
Well, it's not only that, but it's generating the funding in the first place. I mean, for example, people assume the gas tax is paying for all of this, and that hasn't been true for about 30 years. The gas tax was last raised in 1993, and that's 1994 was the feds, the state was 1993, and the buying power of that is about 75% less than what it was. So we have essentially 25% of the buying power that we did, because it's not indexed. It's a flat number, doesn't matter how expensive gas is, and cars are more efficient. And there are electric cars that aren't paying anything at all. So you have all of that confluence coming in, and really it's become very obvious to us that it's up to the locals. You have to find your own money to pay for your own problems.
Yeah. That's pretty complex. Let's turn our attention to the second problem area in the county as far as our roads are concerned, and that's Highway 65 itself.
Yes.
Now, it's kind of incredible, but whether you're going on a Saturday or a Sunday or weekday, Highway 65 is seemingly always backed up.
It is true.
Where's that project at, and where would you prioritize that project?
I would say that's probably our number 2 project, and that is also in the environmental stage. The environmental process on that is a little simpler, because all of the widening that you need to do is within existing right-of-way. So Caltrans owns the right-of-way. You don't have the issues of impacts to outside properties. So that makes it easier.
Well, let's back up a little bit. The project itself that we're talking about,
This one.
this is a picture of Highway 65. I think that we're looking at the northbound lanes just beyond Galleria on that picture.
That is correct.
This is a diagram or a map of...
Of where we're talking about within the county.
So you're talking about widening 65 all the way from Galleria up to Lincoln Boulevard.
Yes, and I want to emphasize that the widening between I-80 and Galleria is part of the 8065 project.
Right.
So it's not like we're leaving that
Right.
as is. Yes, this project would add lanes in the center, because there is room, as well as outside lanes, those auxiliary lanes I mentioned, between the interchanges, which adds quite a bit of capacity and maneuver room.
This is about 6 or 7 miles, I believe, and possibly will be done in different stages as well.
It will probably be phased, because clearly the first and largest problem is on the south end of that.
Yes, from Blue
certainly
Oaks up to Galleria.
I would say clearly the first phase of that we'd want to address is between Pleasant Grove and Galleria,
Right.
especially on the southbound side.
Yes.
That's a particularly
That's the
bad
biggest
area.
problem area.
But, the entire corridor needs to be widened. We have an estimate on that of $115 million, and that's mostly construction. And we have developer impact fees that would pay for $67 million of that.
So this looks like this project would probably be still at least 8, 9, 10 years out?
If we had the money,
Yeah.
through some other means, we could probably be under construction on that, I'm going to guess, in 2 years, maybe 3.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
incredibly fast.
In my world, that's tomorrow.
Yeah, it is.
I know,
and it's
and
because right away is no issue and so on.
Right.
So,
And it's fairly easy to design, but, for the traveling public,
yeah.
2 or 3 years, my goodness, you're frustrated. And that's one of the challenges. You try and get ahead of these things, and I would if there was any way to do so, but, you can only do with what money you've got.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Let's switch topics a little bit. We've talked a lot about roads, and certainly the roads affect everyone in Placer County in a lot of ways.
Right.
Let's talk about another thing that the transportation agency deals with, and that's public transportation. What's the status of public transportation in Placer County, and what are the things that you are working on in that area?
Well, I'd say that, you get a bit of a theme in all transportation is that we are doing everything we can with what little resources we've got. And so, certainly there is transit available, the traditional fixed route transit that people think about when they think of buses that are in all the urban areas and most of the county. Certainly as you get out into the rural areas, it doesn't make sense. And the funding that goes to transit is primarily there are laws, state laws, that determine how you can use that. And one of the requirements is that it be cost effective. And the cost effectiveness is that at least 10% of what it costs to operate the system has to come from people paying fares. And that's a good sense of whether the service is popular enough, there are enough people paying for fares, that makes it worthwhile. There's a lot of areas of the county it doesn't make sense. And with the limited revenues that there are, you put it where it's going to do the most good. That said, we have a number of transit programs that benefit specific, really the highest needs. For example, we operate what is known as Health Express, which is non-emergency medical transportation, primarily for seniors and disabled people, and that's throughout the county. We have put together what we call a call center, and for anyone who needs any dial-a-ride service or any kind of transit trip planning or trip information, there's one number throughout the county that you call, and they can figure it out for you.
And that number?
745-7560. And it's good for 530 or 916.
Oh, okay. Are there any other issues that you would like to talk about? I think we've covered most of the ones that we had.
I want to talk about road maintenance.
Okay.
Potholes.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of a mainstay of transportation, and it's used by every mode of transportation. Well, almost any, but buses ride on the roads, bikes, pedestrians, as well as cars and trucks, and goods movement is a big part of that. And what we're seeing is that our pavement condition in Placer County is starting to really plummet. Our average, there's something called a pavement condition index. It used to be one of the highest in the state, and one of the reasons was because there was so much development in South Placer that it really overshadowed some of the crumbling roads through the rest of the county. Well, what's happening now is that as some of this development has gotten a little older, it's starting to show its age. And I talked a little bit about the gas tax and how its buying power at this point. At this point, it pays for less than half of what it costs just to maintain the roads, let alone do any improvements. And so what's happened is all of the jurisdictions are, plugging holes on almost a literal basis instead of doing the maintenance they need to do. It's an issue in Roseville, but it's an even bigger issue as you get out into the more rural areas.
So what is your plans? How would you get the additional funds to be able to do that?
Well, and this is something we've been working on a couple of years on what we call our transportation funding strategy to figure out what are the top priority projects, and not the Christmas tree of everything you'd like to do, but the really top projects versus the amount of money we've got. And the gap is about $1.75 billion over the next 30 years. And working with a very widespread group of folks from all over the county, all kinds of different interests, what the recommendation was to bridge that gap was to look at a transportation sales tax. Now, a tax is, practically the third rail in terms of discussion in Placer County, but, Sacramento County, actually all of the urban counties in California have had these for more than 30 years.
Right.
And about 2/3 of the money that has gone into the state transportation system has been from transportation sales taxes. And so it puts us even further behind in terms of any kind of competition, that we don't have one. So the board listened to this and said, yeah, go out and talk to people and get feedback, and let's see if that's viable. And we have done. I've been out to, Rotary clubs, and I'm trying to get out there, and that's why your invitation is very helpful too.
How much of a sales tax increase are you thinking of?
What we're looking at is exactly what Sacramento has, which is 0.5% over 30 years. And that would generate about $1.25 billion. And we think that having that magnitude of local money generated would leverage some of those discretionary dollars. But, it's important, but almost as important is it also is a funding source that allows bonding because it's a stable funding source. So we could start on these projects right away. We wouldn't have to save up the money like the developer fees. And the developer fees wouldn't go away.
Right.
This is in addition to those.
Right.
And so that's what we're out talking to folks about. As I say, we did some polling last year that had our positives in the low 60%, around 62, 63%, which in a county as conservative as Placer is pretty notable.
Good. Yes.
Now, of course, it does require a 2/3 majority at a countywide vote. So that's something that's under consideration, and we'll see. A decision will be made whether it'll go on the ballot probably in the next year or so.
And if it does go on the ballot, we're looking at probably 2016?
2016.
Okay. Good luck with that. That sounds exciting. It sounds worthwhile, and we'll see if that actually can make it.
Well,
it's a challenge.
From my decades in transportation, and if I don't say so myself, I'm pretty good with transportation money. I think this is probably our last and best resort.
Well, I can tell you, Celia, I think we're all very honored and blessed to have you with us and working for us here in Placer County. I really want to thank you for joining us on the show today. You're a fountain of information and always a pleasure to talk to. So thank you for being with us today. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us. And until next time, good night.